Hey guys, tonight we begin with a trick that sounds more like wizardry than practicality walking through a cold, mist-choked forest with fire in your pocket. Not metaphorical fire, not optimism, actual fire. A smoldering ember from your home hearth, wrapped up in moss and tucked into a hollow horn like a warm little secret that might mean the difference between soup and starvation. Warmth or frostbite, signal or silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always love seeing this sleepy little global village come to life. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a medieval village, the kind with a thatched roof over your head and the occasional goat with boundary issues sniffing your doorway. The fire in your hearth isn't ambience, it's survival. And when you need to leave for the next village, say to visit your cousin who insists he didn't borrow your ox, you don't just grab your walking stick and hope for the best. You bring the fire with you. Because you know that building a fire, from scratch, flint, steel, sparks, prayer, maybe a blood sacrifice to the weather gods, isn't a gamble you want to take at dusk with cold fingers. So you reach for the ember bundle. It starts with a bit of charcoal, glowing faintly in the ash. You pluck it with care. Burns are a little too medieval, even for you. Nestle it into a pouch of dried moss or pumpkin, something fibrous enough to insulate, but not suffocate. You might wrap that in linen soaked in saltpeter or animal fat. A recipe that sounds like an accident waiting to happen, but was actually a smart way to keep the ember alive longer. Sometimes the ember was placed inside a hollowed-out ram's horn, sometimes a leather pouch, sometimes a small tin box, if you were lucky or rich. You carry it like a secret, pressed close to your body to protect it from the wind. Hours later, when you reach your destination or need to make camp in the middle of nowhere, you gently open your bundle. It's still warm. You blow softly. A faint orange glow perks up. The ember hungry but polite. A few twigs, a curl of dry grass, and suddenly you've got a flame like summoning a spirit with breath instead of incantations. This wasn't just a convenience. It was your insurance policy. Because in the Middle Ages, fire was heat, light, security, a cooking source, an insect repellent, a smoke signal, and an emotional support system, all rolled into one. It was the core of domestic life, the heartbeat of a home, and losing it meant serious trouble. If your house fire went out in winter, it could take half a day to relight it. Assuming you had dry tinder and steady hands, which you often didn't. That's why entire communities passed fire between neighbors. It was communal, ceremonial, even superstitious. You could walk up to a neighbor's home and say, "My fire died," and depending on your relationship, you'd either be handed an ember or told, "Should have packed your moss, Gerald." It was embarrassing to be the one knocking at dusk asking for a light, but not uncommon. Think of it as the medieval version of forgetting your phone charger. Instead of 2% battery, it was life or hypothermia. In some areas, particularly in colder or more remote regions, people would even cultivate slow-burning logs or smoldering peat designed to last through the night or across travel days. Peat especially was treasured for its long, smoky burn, though it came with the side effect of smelling like your kitchen was being slowly smoked by a soggy swamp. The ember bundle could smolder for hours, and skilled travelers knew how to revive even a fading one with breath, fluff, and a handful of dry grass. Some even carried multiple types of tinder with the moss, dried bark, fungi like horsehoof fungus, or tinder conch, known as foamies. Fomentarius, an ancient firestarter, so effective that it's been found in Bronze Age burial sites, and was used by CIC, the Iceman. Yes, that's your fun mainstream fact for this section. Fire carrying was so important. We've literally found prehistoric humans buried with their fire kits. And here's the quirky part. Some folks carried fire, not just for warmth or food, but to trade. Fire could be gifted, traded, or withheld as a form of social control. Sharing fire meant hospitality and alliance. Denying someone fire was an insult, bordering on hostile. It wasn't just utility. It was etiquette. the unresolved mystery here. Just how widespread and standardized ember-carrying practices were across different regions. We know from fragments of Norse sagas, medieval herbals, and later survival guides that people carried fire, but the exact regional variations, pouch types, ember treatments, and materials used are still debated. Some scholars argue for more structured systems, ceremonial fire carrying, even fire cults, while others believe it was mostly improvised and undocumented. That's the frustrating joy of medieval research. Sometimes the only thing left is the scorch mark. Of course not. Every fire made it. Sometimes embers died in transit, smothered by damp air or crushed by clumsy handling. Then you were back to striking sparks, cursing flint, and praying your numb fingers would hold steady long enough to catch a flame. And in winter, that delay could be the difference between sleeping next to soup or becoming it. Travelers with sensitive hands sometimes wrapped their ember bundles in rabbit fur, or even tucked them near their chest beneath layers. Carefully insulated, but always on edge. And yes, there were fire accidents. Entire carts caught fire. Capes smoldered. Homes burned. But the risk was considered worth it, because the alternative was colder, slower, and far more dangerous. There's something strangely intimate about the ember bundle. You cradle it like a fragile pet. You coax it like it might whisper a secret. And when it finally catches, when your new fire flares up from that sleeping kolu, feel a tiny victory. One shared across centuries with every traveler who kept fire breathing through wind, rain, and wandering. It's a survival tactic, wrapped in moss mythology, and a surprisingly delicate understanding of combustion. Today, you might carry a lighter, or a magnesium striker, or a portable stove, but none of those will ever quite match the odd satisfaction of unwrapping a bit of ember-stuffed sheep's wool, breathing life into it with your lungs, and watching it rise into flame like you've just cast a fire spell using only patience and a bit of moss. That's not just survival. That's medieval magic. In the quiet hollows of medieval villages, where every home smelled faintly of ash, peat smoke, and turnip stew, the hearth wasn't just a place for warmth and comfort, it was a critical survival zone. And what you hid behind it might determine whether your family ate or starved through the cruel bite of winter. The practice was both practical and secretive, and it spoke volumes about a world where hunger was a constant ghost rattling through the rafters. It all began with a meat precious, rare, almost holy in its presence. In lean seasons, which frankly described most seasons, meat was both a luxury and a risk. It attracted attention, not just from thieves or hungry neighbors, but from tax collectors and feudal authorities who demanded their share. So, villagers developed a quiet, clever way to keep their meat out of sight, but close to preservation. Smoke hiding trick. Behind the hearthstone, in the recess of the chimney, or even buried partially in ash near the fire pit, meat could be gently smoked without being seen. This wasn't just for flavor. Smoke acted like a medieval force field on insect, pelling, and drying. Suspended on a makeshift hook carved from antler or wood and looped with leather twine, a haunch of pork or venison could slowly dry under the cloak of soot and fire breath. But the trick wasn't merely placing the meat there, it was making it disappear into the daily rhythm of the hearth. Women, who ran the household economy with genius precision, would layer firewood, ashes, and even blackened cloths to obscure the view. If a taxman entered danned, they often did, with more eyes than manners, they might see only smoke and smudges, never suspecting that dinner was dangling inches from the chimney wall. The smell, of course, was the great giveaway, and so women deployed another line of defense, the onion trick. Charred onions, pungent herbs like hyssop, and even old garlic skins would be tossed into the fire to distort the aroma. The result was a cocktail of smells so wild and earthy that even trained noses couldn't pick out the thread of pork or lamb. Children were coached in silence, warned with folklore and sharp glances, not to mention what hung in the hearth. Slip of the tongue could mean confiscation or worse, accusation of hoarding, a serious offense during famine. In some regions, meat was hidden not just from taxman, but from the church. Particularly during fasting seasons, when consumption was restricted, monks might roam to enforce Lenten discipline, and the smell of bacon sizzling in a poor cottage could invite holy scrutiny. The smoke hiding trick was therefore not only about hunger, but about navigating a complex web of religious and political control. Even the shape of the hearth was adapted to this double life. In older homes, where the chimney was a broad walk-in tunnel, meat could be suspended high in the flue, turning black with soot but remaining edible for months. Sometimes villagers would wrap the meat in muslin soaked in brine and ash, a camouflage layer that protected against rot and suspicion alike. Travelers who stayed in these homes might never suspect that, above their heads, dozens of secret sausages slowly aged in the rafters. In other places, meat wasn't just hidden from sight, but also moved in cycles. A piece might hang behind the hearth during the day, and be placed in an attic box filled with salt and straw at night. This back and forth minimized smoke exposure, while allowing control over preservation and ancient dance between salt and smoke. Decay and delay. The ingenuity didn't end at meat. Butter too was hidden in plain sight. Crocks of churned butter were sometimes stored beneath ash mounds near the edge of the fire pit. The residual warmth keeping the fat from hardening completely, while preventing spoilage. Children learned early how to reach just deep enough to retrieve the butter without burning their hands. This was life knowledge, passed down in whispers rather than written words. And then there were the fake hearthstones, flat slabs that could be lifted like trapdoors to reveal small pits where food was stored underground in clay pots. These pits used the same principle as a modern root cellar, dark, cool, and safe from pests, but with the added advantage of being perfectly hidden under the center of family life. Even in castles, where resources were more abundant, smoke hiding remained a useful trick among the lower-ranking staff, or in times of siege. A castle under attack could run out of supplies quickly, and hiding food from one's own desperate neighbors became as crucial as keeping it from the enemy. In such times, entire slabs of salted meat would be encased in soot clay mixtures and hidden inside the chimney wall. Days later, the outer shell would be cracked away to reveal perfectly edible meat, as if unearthed from a prehistoric refrigerator. Not all meat was for immediate eating either. Some was preserved for barter, used in quiet exchanges between households for eggs, linen, or medicinal herbs. A hidden haunch could become currency, far more stable than coin in a world where inflation could be caused by a bad harvest or a greedy lord. These barter systems relied on trust and secrecy, and a shared knowledge that behind every hearth, something valuable might be softly smoking. Stories grew around these practices. Folk tales warned of spirits that lived behind the hearth, punishing children who touched the hidden food. These myths weren't just superstition, they were a subtle form of household security. Scare a child, and you silence a risk. And so the smoke hiding trick wasn't just a technique, it became a ritual, woven into the daily life of medieval survival. The hearth was a cauldron of comfort and cunning, of meals and misdirection. It cooked your stew, warmed your bones, and hid your last slice of hope from hungry eyes. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded you that in a world ruled by scarcity and suspicion, survival didn't come from strength alone. It came from secrets, whispered in smoke. No one wrote down the formulas, and no guild trained you in this kind of stealth cooking. It was passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to friend, through glances, gestures, and the quiet choreography of keeping food just visible enough to preserve, but invisible enough to protect. Some say this knowledge has vanished, lost, to time like ash scattered on the wind. But look closely at old hearthstones in crumbling cottages, and you might see the telltale grooves, the soot stains, and the faint scent of smoked meat still lingering in the stone's pores. They are echoes of a time when the hearth wasn't just the heart of the home, it was the hiding place of the village's last true feast. They didn't have barbed wire. They didn't have electric fences, iron gates, or motion-detecting security systems. What they had instead was something far more curious, quiet, and clever: a living wall. Imagine walking into a medieval village, not surrounded by towering stone ramparts, but by a dense, tangled, almost impassable wall of thorny hedges, gnarled with years of slow growth, and whispering with the breeze like a murmured warning. It wasn't built in a day, no. This was the kind of defense only patience could produce, known by names like the hedge rampart or hedge and ditch system. This method involved cultivating thick, intertwining bushes such as hawthorn, blackthorn, hazel, or even brambles plants chosen not for beauty or bounty, but for their aggression. These weren't cute garden hedges, trimmed with scissors. These were wild, gnarled, painful things that clawed and caught at anything trying to pass. The process began by digging a ditch, sometimes double wide, the earth from which was piled to one side to form a bank. Then, into this bank, villagers planted saplings or cuttings, carefully chosen and placed. But they didn't just plant them upright, like you'd imagine. No, they used a technique called pleaching, which involved partially cutting through the stems, so they could be bent over without killing the plant, essentially forcing them to grow horizontally. Weaving one into another, a botanical braid of defense. Over time, as the plants grew and healed, the twisted branches would become almost impenetrable, reinforced not by iron but by sheer density and evolution. In some cases, especially in Anglo-Saxon regions, this living wall became so intertwined that even small animals couldn't wriggle through, let alone a thief or soldier. These weren't fences you repaired with nails, and these were things you pruned with gloves and prayers. And they weren't just for keeping people out. They doubled as a form of agricultural zoning. Inside these living walls, livestock were corralled safely, crops could grow undisturbed, and even pathways were bordered by these defensive shrubs, making sure the lanes remained lanes and not shortcuts for wandering feet. What's even stranger is that over the years, these barriers gained a kind of legal status. In parts of medieval England, for instance, hedge-bound property lines became recognized boundaries, passed on through generations, with disputes resolved by checking the age and growth pattern of a hedge. Can you imagine that? Settling a legal dispute by consulting the testimony of a thorn bush. And these living fences weren't just static either. People trained them. That's right, they actually shaped these hedges, like apprentices, guiding the growth of each limb, sometimes incorporating deadwood, rocks, or mud into the base, to make them even more formidable. In some places, they added a secondary ditch beyond the hedge, so that even if an invader made it through the first tangle of thorns, they'd be met with a pitfall or a sudden drop. Some medieval hedge systems even served military purposes. In rural borderlands, one watchman needed a signal or a hiding spot. They used hollows built into these walls, camouflaged niches where a man could crouch unseen for hours. And the best part, these natural defenses grew stronger over time, unlike wooden palisades that rotted or metal gates that rusted. A well-tended hedge became thicker, tougher, and more vicious with every year. In fact, some of these ancient hedgerows still exist today, winding their way through English countryside. Paths are standing stubbornly at the edge of old farmland, centuries-old relics of a time when survival was slow, patient, and green. But the use of hedges wasn't just limited to security or livestock control. They also shaped ecosystems. In a medieval world where deforestation was already widespread, these living walls provided much-needed shelter for birds, insects, and small mammals. Birds nested inside them, keeping the insect population down. The insects in turn pollinated nearby crops. Small mammals used them as highways, moving safely from one corner of a field to another without being spotted by hawks. In a very real sense, growing your own wall wasn't just about protection, it was about participation in a self-sustaining, miniature ecosystem. Some monasteries even planted symbolic hedge mazes, or enclosed sacred gardens with them, believing the circle of thorns offered spiritual protection as much as physical. There are records of certain medieval hedge systems being so thick and well-crafted that wolves, even in their stronger, less shy medieval form, couldn't breach them, which meant children could play inside fields or courtyards relatively safely, while parents worked nearby. And imagine what it took to maintain these things. A village might appoint a hedge warden or assign seasonal duties to different families to keep the wall healthy, free of diseased branches, and trained properly. There was a skill to pruning one that required timing, the right blade, and a deep familiarity with the plant's growth cycle. Cut too early, and you'd kill the branch. Cut too late, and you'd have a wild shoot undoing years of careful weaving. This was long-haul defense, the kind you couldn't rush. And the symbolism stuck, too. In folklore and oral storytelling, hedges took on a deeper meaning. They were boundaries not just between properties, but between worlds. Witches were said to live beyond the hedge. Fairies supposedly waited at hedge gaps, and it was considered bad luck to step through an opening without saying a protective rhyme. Some hedges were even given names: the Devil's Snare, Old Mother's Teeth, or Whisper Wall. These weren't just plants, they were characters in the medieval landscape, with moods and reputations. And perhaps most fascinating is this: by the time a hedge wall reached full maturity, say 50 to 100 years, it was considered almost sacred. You didn't uproot one casually. In fact, disturbing an old hedge without a compelling reason was frowned upon in many communities, as if breaking it meant breaking with tradition, safety, and ancestral effort. That's how much value they placed in these living barriers, part defense, part legend, part inheritance. Today, we rush for speed. Back then, they planted for generations. They knew the best kind of survival didn't come from speed or steel, but from patient roots and tangled growth. So next time you pass an old, gnarled bush in a country lane, think about it. It might not just be a plant. It might be a centuries-old survivor, still standing guard. Long before programmable thermostats and radiators humming gently in modern homes, medieval people relied on materials as ancient as the dirt beneath their feet to regulate the warmth and coolness of their dwellings. And the most unsung of these was clay. Not just a building material, but a survival strategy in itself. Clay possessed thermal properties that turned peasant cottages into naturally heated shelters and passive coolers without any moving parts, and without anyone ever uttering the word insulation. Imagine stepping into a medieval cottage on a freezing January morning in Yorkshire, your boots crunching through the hard frost outside, only to feel a curious, trapped warmth inside that clung to your skin like a thick woolen shawl. This wasn't magic. It was clay, mixed with straw, animal hair, and water, and slapped onto a latticework of wattle branches. Clay became wattle and daub, the standard for walls across vast swaths of medieval Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. This mixture dried into panels of shockingly effective thermal mass, which did something quite brilliant. It absorbed heat slowly when it was hot, and released it gradually when it got cold. That meant homes warmed in the sun would stay cozy into the evening, and even retained internal warmth from a fire or body heat long after flames had died down. Clay was, in effect, a time-shifting temperature bank. This wasn't a conscious engineering marvel. It was discovered through trial, error, and sheer stubborn survival instinct. People noticed that homes built from raw timber let in bitter winds through every warped plank, but structures packed with dense earth seemed to hold the air inside like a cupped hand around a candle. These homes were literally breathing with the seasons. The same went for floors, while some peasants had to settle for bare soil. Those with slightly more resources would stamp down clay into smooth, hardened floors that never turned to mud in the rain and remained pleasantly cool in summer months. And yes, they sometimes mixed in animal dung, not for fun, but because it added fibrous strength and repelled certain pests. They didn't care how it smelled, as long as it kept out the damp and the rats. In castles and monasteries, where a bit more knowledge passed between educated monks and stonemasons, clay was used deliberately to coat inner walls, seal up gaps in stonework, and even line fireplaces or bake ovens to create thermal retention chambers. When a hearth was lit, the thick clay surround would slowly soak in the heat, and hours later, even after the fire had died, the walls would continue radiating gentle warmth. Some churches even experimented with what we now call hypocaust style heating by placing hot stones or embers beneath clay-tiled floors. Primitive radiant heating that came centuries before Roman innovations were readopted in Renaissance architecture. But even among peasants, there was a deep, almost instinctual understanding of how to manipulate earthen materials. Farmers storing root vegetables would dig clay-lined pits beneath their homes or barns, using the coolness of the earth and the moisture-sealing power of clay to keep carrots and beets fresh for months. A carefully layered pit with straw and packed clay could prevent rot, mold, and temperature spikes better than many early refrigerators. Clay also played a strange and often overlooked role in controlling indoor humidity. In rainy regions, it was common for homes to become soggy nightmares filled with mildew, and yet the villagers who used thick clay walls often suffered less. Why? because clay could absorb moisture from the air when humidity arose, and release it slowly when the air dried out, acting as a natural buffer against sudden spikes and drops. This kept wooden beams from cracking, bread from molding too fast, and sleeping conditions from becoming unbearable. Even the color of the clay mattered lighter. Sandy mixes reflected heat better in summer, while darker clays absorbed and retained more warmth in the winter. Choices often made, not with charts or instruments, but by watching what worked over time and passing that wisdom on orally. Clay tiles were used for roofs in regions where thatching was unavailable or vulnerable to wind and fire. These tiles did more than just shed rain. They reflected sunlight and deflected heat, creating upper chambers that stayed bearable in warmer months. Even chimney flues were sealed or constructed with clay-based mortar to handle the massive heat variations without crumbling to dust. But the truly fascinating thing is how clay shaped daily behavior. Peasants who understood their walls would hold warmth for only a few hours, learn to cook and bathe strategically. You'd boil water for porridge in the morning, not just to eat, but also to warm the home. You'd sleep on benches built into walls, maximizing body heat absorption into the clay overnight. Entire families would cluster together around a central hearth, not only for conversation and companionship, but because their combined warmth would charge the room like a medieval battery. Some of the most curious uses of clay for climate survival were found in desert regions, in Islamic Spain, North Africa, and the Levant. Artisans developed tabia walls, thick clay and gravel mixes, beaten into molds, then dried in sunbaked layers. These walls were sometimes 3 feet thick, and in their sheer massiveness, they trapped nighttime coolness to release it slowly throughout the searing daylight hours. Clay jars and vessels also doubled as low-tech air conditioners. In a trick still used in rural areas today, wide-mouthed clay pots would be filled with water, and as the liquid slowly evaporated through the porous surface, it would cool the surrounding air by several degrees. These were placed near sleeping areas, doorways, or even next to stored grain to keep pests away and temperature low. It wasn't fancy, it was genius born of desperation. Even medicine and comfort involved clay. Cold clay packs were applied to feverish foreheads or aching limbs, serving as both compress and spiritual balm. Some villagers swore that the red clay from specific hills had healing powers, and while most of that may have been folk belief, modern science does show that certain clays contain minerals with antibacterial properties. These clays were stored, moistened, and smeared with almost religious reverence. There are even accounts of soldiers in certain medieval skirmishes carrying hardened clay pellets they could heat near a fire and wrap in cloth as crude hand warmers, or even toss into water to rapidly cool it by absorbing thermal energy weather. These accounts are myth or fact. They show how deeply this material embedded itself in the mental landscape of survival. Even medieval inns knew the trick. Clay stoves would be preheated for travelers who would press themselves against them gratefully after cold journeys. Often these stoves weren't merely for cooking, but built with long, thick walls that retained warmth into the next day, allowing both stews and bones and people to simmer in the afterglow. The irony is, as stone and timber became signs of wealth, clay came to be associated with poverty, decay, and peasant life. People forgot that for hundreds of years, entire generations stayed alive not because they had wealth or even knowledge, but because they knew how to slap a wall full of earth, dung, straw, and sweat into something that hugged them back during the darkest, coldest nights. The humble clay wall wasn't just a construction technique, it was a seasonal ally, a memory keeper, and a silent, reliable machine humming in the background of 1,000 unrecorded lives. So the next time you adjust your thermostat a few degrees and shiver at the cold, imagine a medieval child curled up next to a clay wall, still warm from last night's fire, dreaming safely under a roof sealed with nothing more than grit, ash, and hardened time. In a world without non-stick pans, enamel coatings, or mass-produced steel pots, medieval cooking was an everyday gamble between fire, food, and fragile clay. The average cook in a medieval village didn't waltz into a kitchen lined with cookware or gleaming copper-bottomed saucepans. They stood instead before smoky hearths, soot-streaked walls, and a humble collection of earthenware pots that were as brittle as they were essential. These pots, glazed, handmade, and fired in communal kilns, had a nasty habit of cracking, crumbling, or worse, sticking to food like an uninvited second skin. But medieval villagers, particularly housewives and apprentices in bustling manors and creaky cottages, weren't content with just letting food burn. They had a method so strange and so time-consuming, you might assume it was punishment rather than innovation. It was called friction glazing, and it involved the oddly satisfying practice of rubbing one's cookware until it glowed with a sheen not unlike polished stone. Imagine a kitchen apprentice, hunched over a clay pot, for hours, maybe days, a smooth river stone across its outer surface, applying pressure in long rhythmic strokes, wearing down the porous clay grain by grain. No water, no oil, just raw friction. The goal, a smooth, hardened layer that would help resist water absorption, prevent grime from embedding, and allow hot liquids to glide rather than soak into the surface. This was the poor cook's version of Teflon, an improvised answer to centuries of sticky stews and crusted-over porridges. There was a reason why this wasn't just a vanity project in glazed pottery. When exposed to high temperatures and repeated use, could flake, crack, or even explode when saturated with water and suddenly heated. But by polishing the surface, by hand with friction, the clay's surface structure became tighter, denser, and ever so slightly water. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't permanent, but it was enough to buy precious months or even years of use from a single pot. In some parts of medieval Europe, especially in Germanic and Slavic regions, entire guilds revolved around the creation of durable domestic pottery, and friction glazing was considered a foundational step in the training of young apprentices. This wasn't just for the pot's body either. Pot lids, handles, and even the bottom rim were painstakingly burnished to ensure a longer life and a better cook. If the pot was particularly precious, say a favorite stew pot passed down generations, then the entire family might pitch in, taking turns over several days, until the clay shimmered like aged marble. Interestingly, friction glazing didn't just serve a functional purpose. It was also seen as a sign of cleanliness and order. A well-glazed pot reflected better on a household's hygiene and discipline. In folk tradition, a housewife with scuffed or cracked pots might be quietly judged during feast days or community cooking gatherings. Worse still, unglazed or neglected pots could leach undesirable flavors into stews or leak subtle bitterness into broths. Crime akin to culinary sabotage in a culture where every meal was earned with sweat and firewood. Many medieval kitchens kept a glazing stone, a flat, palm-sized rock, with a polished edge near the hearth, or embedded in a kitchen wall for easy access. These stones were handed down much like heirloom utensils. Some were marked with tiny runes or family symbols, not for magic, but for pride. This stone belonged to us. It fed our kin. In other parts of Europe, women used animal bones, especially shoulder blades or femur shafts, to burnish their pots. A tradition probably born from necessity, but later turned into lore. It was said that certain bones gave better shine, and children often whispered that using the bone of a fox would curse the soup, while using the bone of a lamb would bless it. There were even songs sung during the glazing process, repetitive, trance-like melodies meant to keep time during the hours-long ordeal. Glazing wasn't limited to the inside or outside of pots either. Skilled potters often friction glazed the lip of the vessel, the very rim from which soup might be poured or sipped. A smooth lip reduced chipping and gave the cook better control. It's a detail so small it sounds absurd. Yet medieval recipes sometimes required delicate pouring techniques, dribbling broth into a trencher of bread without soaking the crust, and in those moments, the rim of your pot became a tool, not just a container. What's more fascinating is how friction glazing became wrapped up in superstition. In some English villages, it was believed that a pot burnished during a full moon would resist mold better, and in Nordic lands, mothers would teach daughters to rub their pots while whispering protective chants, not for the pot, but for the stew inside. Let no rot cling, let no hunger stay, one old Danish line went. There were even tales of travelers bringing their own burnishing stones with them, tucked into bundles beside spoons, and tinderboxes, a reminder that the difference between a good meal and a miserable one might depend entirely on whether your pot was polished. Occasionally, Medieval markets sold pots that had already been friction glazed by artisans, and these fetched higher prices than standard earthenware. Wealthier households might purchase a full set of glazed cooking pots, reserving the best one for guests or religious feast days. Others glazed their pots with a mixture of ash and salt rubbed in with heat, which created a crude chemical reaction resembling primitive glazing. But this method was risky, sometimes leading to brittle surfaces or uneven heating. Friction glazing, though slower, was safer and more personal. It was, in its own way, an act of patience, of devotion, of domestic craftsmanship, honed in smoky silence. The kitchen might be filled with the scent of onions frying in animal fat, the hiss of water meeting hot coals, and beneath it, all the soft, relentless sound of clay being polished with stone. A sound of survival, a sound of care, a sound that said, "This pot will last one more winter." Today, modern archaeologists examining medieval cookware often find telltale signs of friction glazing, fine striations across the surface, smoothing inconsistent with wheel turning or kiln firing. These subtle grooves tell stories the pot itself cannot. Of fingers grown calloused through repetition, of afternoons spent in warm light scraping gently at the same patch of clay, of a world where you didn't throw things away, you restored them. Even museum curators, handling medieval pots with gloves and reverence, sometimes run their fingers over the polished rim and remark on the eerie smoothness, wondering who last touched it and what stew once bubbled inside. In the age of microwaves and dishwashers, the notion of laboring for hours just to make a pot usable sounds almost absurd. Yet for medieval people, especially those eking out an existence at the margins of the feudal system, it was these little acts of refusing to let the fire win, or the clay crumble, that made all the difference between surviving and starving. A pot wasn't just a tool, it was a partner, and sometimes the only way to keep it alive was to rub it, lovingly and endlessly, until it shone like stone. In those slow circular movements, silent, meditative, ancient lay one of the quietest, strangest, and most enduring secrets of medieval survival. In the medieval world, survival wasn't just about growing food or keeping warm. It often came down to whether you could make it home without getting lost in a land where paths twisted like rumors and signposts were as rare as peace treaties. To navigate through thick forests, winding lanes, and low visibility marshes, peasants, traders, and travelers alike relied not just on what they could see, but what they could hear. While modern ears might tune out the faint bleating of sheep or the hollow clang of a distant bell, medieval ears, sharpened over years of experience, paid rapt attention to such sounds. For they were more than background noise, they were lifelines. Church bells in particular were the GPS of the age. Each village had its own bell, with a tone as unique as a fingerprint, and locals knew which bell belonged to which parish. A certain depth of clang might indicate the steeple at Westfon, while a sharper toll belonged to Crosshaven, miles away. So even when fog settled thick as porridge, or night smothered the hills, a lone walker could cock his ear, identify the familiar note of home, and follow the sound like a thread through the dark. But it wasn't just bells. Shepherds' calls carried through the hills, sometimes passed down from generations, and each herder had a distinct whistle or chant, often designed not only to guide sheep but to signal others across the pasture. These vocalizations, sometimes more elaborate than short songs, echoed across valleys and forests, letting someone know that life was still pulsing on the other side of the hill. Travelers listened for those calls. Too, they indicated safe, known territory, and by gauging direction and familiarity, one could trace a rough mental map of movement. Footpaths were rarely signposted, and crossroads could confuse even locals. After a bad storm, so navigation became an act of acoustic orientation. Blacksmiths, for instance, had rhythmic hammering patterns that echoed through early mornings or evenings. These sounds helped guide apprentices back to the forge, even if they wandered into a misty field. Sometimes, the smith would deliberately add an extra clang on the third beat, just enough for someone who knew it to realize they were hearing their own master's rhythm. Children were often taught to distinguish these rhythmic cues before they even learned their letters, since the world wasn't organized by maps but by memory and sensation. Wind, too, played its part. A constant breeze from the west brought a rustling over the willow groves near the river, while easterlies might send the scent of smoke and pig dung from the village down into the hollow. Medieval people trained themselves to notice these subtle shifts. Some elderly villagers could tell which direction they were facing just from how the breeze hit their cheekbones, or how the leaves shivered in a certain grove. This might sound romantic, but it was born of necessity and ability, cultivated not for poetry, but for getting back to one's hut before wolves or bandits made the decision for you. Seasonal sounds added another layer. Frogs croaked louder in certain ponds during spring mating. Birds migrated with regular flocks that flapped low or high, depending on weather. And the creak of carts from neighboring hamlets could travel remarkably far on still winter days. Entire calendars were tucked into these subtle soundscapes. And so villagers moved with the seasons, as if they were listening to nature's slow drumbeat. Markets, too, created auditory fingerprints. Every Thursday, the tannery in Bracegate opened early, and locals could hear the squelch of soaked hides being dropped, a grim but familiar noise. That sound meant market was on, and if you were lost in the nearby woods, hearing it through the branches told you which way to turn. Even animals became part of the map. A certain barking dog, in the hamlet of Red Hollow, never shut up after midnight. It was hated and beloved because it was so dependable. Travelers welcomed its relentless noise from a mile off. It told them they were close to a fire, and maybe a warm bowl of something vaguely edible. In areas where literacy was rare and landmarks could change, barns burned down, trees chopped, fields replanted, sounds were the stable points of orientation. The human voice especially played a sacred role in this network. Town criers announced events, tax collection, or visiting nobility, but they also marked space. You might not see them, but you'd hear the same voice shouting in the same square each week, and its echo marked the center of town. Singing, too, had its uses. Certain nuns at remote abbeys were known to sing evening prayers in open-air cloisters, and the melodies traveled over hills. Villagers used those hymns like clock chimes, but also as directional cues. If you could hear the chant of St. Elfrida's on a clear evening, you were roughly 2 miles northwest of it, assuming you knew where the wind was coming from. Even when the Black Death struck and streets emptied, these familiar sounds persisted longer than people. A lonely bell might still toll the hour in a half-dead village, its echo reminding survivors of where they were in a world that no longer made sense. Some scholars have argued that this deeply auditory relationship with space gave medieval people a stronger sense of home than we understand now, not just a location, but a symphony of sounds, smells, and echoes that anchored them even when the roads were shifting or the night crept in early. Echo chambers like stone wells or carved-out rocks added to the mix. Children sometimes played games by shouting into them and listening to the echoes bounce back, but adults used them to measure space or judge weather changes. Some wells echoed more sharply before rain, due to pressure shifts in the surrounding rock and air. You might scoff now, but if you were a goat herder who couldn't afford to get caught in a storm, a singing well could be a better forecast than the sky. In some towns, public courtyards were deliberately shaped to bounce sounds efficiently, letting a whispered warning travel further than you'd expect. Thieves were known to exploit this too. Some used specific claps or calls to signal accomplices about watchmen's patrols. So, sound wasn't just about finding your wit, it was about surviving every hour you were outside the protective ring of your own hearth. At night, with torches flickering and shadows stretching across every stone, a single note or distant chant could draw someone back from the edge of panic. And in a world where the stars weren't always visible and roads were often indistinct lines between one tangle of bramble and the next, trusting your ears wasn't just a trick, it was a daily act of faith. A faith in memory, in repetition, in rhythm, and in the persistent echo of life around you. For medieval people, ears were as important as eyes, perhaps more so when the fog rolled in, the wolves howled, and the only sign of safety was the low, mournful toll of a bell you knew by heart. If you happened to wake up in a medieval village and wandered past the stream where women were pounding laundry on stones, or the dusty road where a blacksmith's rhythmic clang rang out like a war drum, you might catch a glimpse of one of the quieter, aider rituals of daily hygiene. practiced not with the fanfare of a town crier, but with the grim focus of someone trying not to lose their remaining teeth. Toothbrushing, as you might know it today, with synthetic bristles, flavored pastes, and minty freshness, promising dates and job promotions, would have felt utterly alien to these people. Instead, medieval folk turned to the earth, quite literally, for the materials to clean their teeth. And their go-to solution was a gritty, black powder made from something as humble and unglamorous as burnt wood. Charcoal, usually from hardwood, carefully selected for its burning properties, was ground into a fine, dusty powder. Often mixed with a pinch of salt, the occasional dash of sage or mint leaves, if available, and maybe even some powdered rosemary for the more fastidious or the minor nobility. This was not a morning routine performed in front of a mirror while listening to lo-fi music. It was done with a rag, or sometimes a chewed twig that had been frayed into bristles, dipped into this earthy concoction, and then vigorously rubbed across the teeth, back and forth, sometimes in circular motions if the user had enough surviving teeth to navigate. There were no bathrooms. Of course, these rituals took place near water buckets, communal troughs, or simply outside, while squatting on a stump or leaning against a stone wall. The sensation wasn't pleasant. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with campfire ash mixed with sea breeze, as your gums bled slightly, and a breeze carried away little puffs of gray dust. Yet to the medieval mind, this wasn't barbaric. It was practical. They'd observed that those who used charcoal regularly tended to avoid the worst of tooth rot and decay, which was saying something in an era where dentistry was mostly performed with pliers, prayers, and a leather strap to bite down on. Even monks and clerics recorded the benefits of certain herbs for the breath and gums, noting which ones soothed infections or kept your mouth feeling less like a dragon's cave. Breath was no small matter either. There are letters in court, documents that hint at the importance of smelling at least tolerable, especially in social or trade interactions. The charcoal, combined with salt, served as both an abrasive and antibacterial agent. The salt scoured away plaque and food remnants, while the charcoal absorbed odors and neutralized acidic damage caused by whatever mystery stew had been consumed the night before. In wealthier homes, or among apothecaries and herbalists, additional ingredients might be added: powdered deer antler, crushed pearl, dried mint soaked in wine, and in some cases, urine aged for several days and used as a sort of bleaching rinse. Yes, medieval oral care could veer into the horrifying. But it was always rooted in observation, necessity, and improvisation. In the colder months, some households would store their charcoal in a leather pouch by the hearth, making sure it stayed dry and powdery. If it got damp, it would be left out near the fire to crisp up again. A dry rag was then dipped and rubbed across the teeth, while someone else might be plucking lice from a child's hair nearby, or stirring a pot of lentils. Hygiene wasn't privatized. It was often communal, visible, and pragmatic. Tooth pain, after all, could be debilitating. Without antibiotics, something as simple as a gum infection could become fatal if it spread. Hence, the drive to prevent decay by any means necessary. Charcoal was a form of medieval insurance. Children were often taught by elders how to mix the powders to recognize the best type of charcoal, dense and black, not ashy or light gray, and to avoid charcoal from coniferous trees, which carried too much resin and left an unpleasant taste. Some even believed charcoal had spiritual cleansing properties, connecting the mouth's cleanliness with one's moral state. There are scribbled sermons and marginal notes that compare a clean tongue with a pure soul, urging believers to wash their mouths with the same diligence with which they confessed their sins. In battle, soldiers sometimes carried a small packet of salt and ash as part of their minimal grooming kit, brushing their teeth with fingers after meat and hardtack to avoid painful infections far from any healer's reach. Peasants, of course, adapted with what was locally available charcoal from their own hearth, sometimes even mixed with crushed eggshells or bits of dried bark if salt was too scarce. And yet, despite the lack of peppermint and fluoride, many skulls from the period reveal relatively decent dental wear, especially in communities that practiced regular ash. Dental decay did happen, especially where diets were rich in porridge or bread constantly sticking to the molars. But among those who committed to the charcoal method, there was a noticeable resistance to rot. Of course, Not everything about medieval oral care was so grounded. Superstitions swirled like smoke around the practice. Some believed the devil could enter through a rotting tooth, and that brushing with charcoal blessed on a holy day would prevent not only pain but sin itself. Others avoided looking into reflective surfaces while brushing, fearing spirits might peer back. In certain regions, especially across northern Europe, women would crush birch, charcoal, and mix it with mead, using it both as a cleanser and a mild aphrodisiac, claiming it sweetened their breath and luck in romance. Midwives and herbalists sometimes brushed the gums of infants with ash from sacred fires to strengthen their first teeth and protect them from the toothworm, a mythical creature once believed to cause toothaches by burrowing into molars and gnawing from within. Even the language of dental suffering had a kind of poetry. Tooth fire was how some chronicled pain, and charcoal was considered its elemental antidote, a cooling balm against invisible burning. Strangely, one of the most common associations people today might make that black powder equals dirtiness was reversed in the medieval world. Charcoal was cleanliness. It was purification. It was the village answer to rot, decay, and foulness. In a world with few options, people found comfort in ritual. And brushing teeth with ash wasn't merely functional, it became symbolic, rhythmic, almost meditative. Done at dawn, done at dusk, while livestock stirred or church bells tolled. The scrubbing and spitting were performed with the same regularity as tending to firewood or locking the barn. And for a fleeting moment, the peasant, the merchant, the monk, and the child could all share one small, gritty victory over time and tooth. It may not have tasted good. It may not have sparkled. But it worked well enough to keep teeth and heads and mouths ready for laughter, argument, and bread. The notion that medieval villagers lived in homes partially constructed from animal dung may sound at first like a cruel joke made by history's bored prankster. But in truth, it was one of the most ingenious, pragmatic, and surprisingly enduring survival strategies in the pre-modern world. These humble structures, known by the technical name of wattle and daub, were a testament to the principle that when resources are limited, people will turn to whatever the land offers, even if that land's most abundant resource happens to be the excrement of cows. In the average medieval village, surrounded by farmland, pasture, and not much else, wood and stone were often expensive, rare, or reserved for nobility and churches. Peasants, forced to make do with what they had, discovered that by weaving flexible wooden sticks called wattles into a sort of crisscrossed lattice, then plastering the gaps with a mixture of wet earth, straw, water, clay, and you guessed it, animal dung, they could create walls that were warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and sturdy enough to last for decades if cared for properly. The dung, which was mostly cow-based, served several shockingly useful functions. First, it acted as a natural binder, helping the clay stick together, while also preventing cracking as the mixture dried. Second, it contained bacteria and fibers that made the final structure more flexible, which in turn made it more resistant to seasonal expansion and contraction, the kind that might cause more brittle materials, like stone or dry clay, to crumble or flake apart. Finally, and perhaps most curiously, it had antimicrobial properties that actually helped keep bugs and mold out of the walls. Yes, in a strange twist of irony, the walls made with poop were often more sanitary than the ones made without it. The smell, well, that was largely neutralized during the drying process, especially once a final coat of whitewash or lime plaster was applied. And contrary to what modern sensibilities might assume, these homes didn't reek of manure. By the time a wattle and daub wall had cured under the sun, it smelled more like dry earth and barn hay than anything offensive. Villagers did sleep, eat, give birth, host guests, and even store food in these homes without gagging. In fact, some of the oldest standing examples of wattle and daub construction are still upright today in parts of England, France, and Germany, and many have been lovingly maintained or restored as heritage buildings. Some even have active occupancy permits. Now imagine the skill it required to make one of these walls. It wasn't a matter of slapping together some mud and manure like a toddler playing in the garden. There was an art to it. The wattle had to be woven tightly enough to hold the daub, but loose enough to allow some give. The daub itself had to be mixed to just the right consistency to wet and it would slump, to dry and it would flake. The application process was done by hand, sometimes with bare fingers, and villagers would slap the mixture into place with practiced rhythm, pushing it deep into the weave of the sticks, smoothing it with makeshift trowels, or sometimes just their palms. In some regions, the family's entire seasonal schedule revolved around wall maintenance, especially before the rainy season. Redaubing an old wall was a community event, one that included singing, storytelling, food, and laughter. A sort of domestic festival built around poop and perseverance. Children might be given small patches to patch and decorate, while the adults worked in unison on the major repairs. A particularly skilled elder in the village might even be known as the mud master, someone who could spot a weak batch of daub from across the village green or tell by touch alone whether a wall would survive the next storm. In times of siege, famine, or cold, these walls could mean the difference between life and death. They insulated like champions, holding in the heat from a central hearth long after the fire died down. They could be built fast, which was useful if a family needed shelter before winter arrived, and they could be repaired with nothing more than what lay around the barnyard. People even stored backup daub in pits behind their homes, like medieval emergency cement, ready for action when the first cracks appeared. And since these homes often featured thatched roofs, which themselves were woven from straw, reeds, and other organic matter, the entire structure became a living system of natural survival technology. But there's something even more interesting about these poop-walled homes. They were often decorated. That's right, villagers painted over the daub with lime plaster that was then tinted with natural pigments like ochre, soot, and berry dyes. Some homes were adorned with swirling designs, religious symbols, or even protective runes meant to ward off evil spirits or disease. In wealthier peasant households, intricate patterns might be added to impress guests or indicate social status. Within the village, the walls, though made of muck and manure, became canvases of identity, storytelling, and silent pride. They were not shameful. They were not makeshift. They were resourceful, resilient, and rich with culture. And when the time came to rebuild, whether after a harsh winter, a fire, or the slow decay of time, the materials could be scraped down, rehydrated, and reused. The house, in a very literal sense, was reborn from its own remains. This endless cycle of construction and decay, of walls rising and falling with the seasons, was a core rhythm of medieval survival. It mirrored the cycles of planting and harvesting, birth and death, mud and sun. And so, every time a villager leaned against a cool, dry daub wall after a day in the fields, they weren't just touching a structure. They were touching generations of tradition, sweat, patience, and the unwavering human instinct to survive using whatever the world offers, even if what it offers comes steaming from the backside of a cow. It may not sound glamorous, but it worked. It endured. And perhaps most of all, it stood as a daily reminder that survival wasn't about shining armor or grand castles. It was about knowing how to turn a pile of waste into the very walls that held your family safe through the bitter winds of winter and the endless uncertainties of life. As we drift now into the quieter corners of the medieval bedroom, not a chamber of comfort as we might imagine today, but a battleground of sorts, we encounter a curious layer of defense woven deep into the very place where villagers laid their heads, the mattress. Not a mattress as we know it, of course. There was no memory foam, no spring coils, no linens softened with lavender-scented detergent. Instead, the average sleeping platform in a modest medieval home was a humble tika fabric bag, often made of coarse linen, or hemp stuffed tightly with straw, rushes, feathers, or whatever the season made available. But that's only the beginning, because these bags weren't just about softness, they were weapons. Weapons against an unseen, unrelenting enemy: fleas, lice, and bedbugs. You see, in the medieval mind, comfort was secondary. What mattered most was whether you could close your eyes without scratching yourself to pieces, or waking to find a trail of bites marching across your skin, like some grotesque nocturnal warpath. So the solution? Herbs. And not just any herbs. These were carefully selected botanical guardians. Lavender to lull the senses, rosemary to repel the creeping insects, mint to confuse the scent trail, and wormwood to poison anything too stubborn to leave. Mattress stuffing became a living pharmacy, part bed, part defensive charm, and part folk medicine all in one. Imagine, then, the evening routine. A peasant woman might kneel by the hearth at dusk, not just to tend the fire, but to gather the day's dried cuttings from her herb. Bundles hanging in the rafters. These bundles, sometimes gathered by the dozen, were not just for cooking. They were cut and tied when the summer sun was strong, dried slowly in the warmth of the kitchen ceiling beams, and brought down at just the right time to be crushed between calloused hands and pressed into bedding. The scent of these herbs, potent and earthy, mixed with the natural musk of the home, smoke, sweat, and soot. It wasn't a perfume, it was survival. A mattress restuffed with fresh straw and crushed sage could mean the difference between waking well-rested or waking half-mad with itching. And it didn't stop at the mattress. Medieval sleepers sometimes layered additional dried herbs between their bedclothes. If linen sheets were used and in poorer homes, they rarely were, too, might be rinsed in infusions of herb-scented water, perhaps even boiled with a bit of soapwort and sage, then hung over smoke to dry. Bed curtains, prized in wealthier homes, not just for privacy, but for warmth, often held sachets of dried plants in their folds. The goal was simple: keep the insects away. If you couldn't outfight them, you could at least outsmell them. And this wasn't a habit confined to the countryside. In monasteries, where monks lived in ordered rows of narrow cells and shared their lives with silence, discipline, and the occasional lice infestation, herbal remedies were meticulously recorded. Monastic herbals hand-copied books, filled with ink, sketches of plants, and their uses explained how to prepare sleep sachets, bundles of dried flowers, crushed between linen wraps, to tuck inside the hood of a cloak or beneath the hem of a bedroll. Some even believed the strong scent of certain herbs could drive away bad dreams or evil spirits. Whether the goal was comfort or exorcism, the result was the same. Beds smelled of thyme, not thread count. Children learned early which herbs to gather. Grandmothers passed down the secret timings. Mint must be cut before it blooms. Lavender, after the bees have drunk their fill. Wormwood before it becomes too woody. These plants grew close to the home not by accident, but by careful intention. The medieval garden, often enclosed by a low wattle fence or a crumbling stone wall, wasn't just a place for food. It was a living medicine cabinet. Housewives and herbalists alike knew how to rub sage along the mattress seams or strew valerian under the cradle. Even the act of stuffing the bed became ritualistic can and dove harvest tradition. In some villages, new stuffing came once a year after the grain harvest, the empty stalks being put to good use in beds. During that time, herbs were layered in with care, often blessed or accompanied by whispered prayers. Superstition and practicality danced together like candlelight on plaster walls. But here's a strange twist. Some historians believe that herb-stuffed beds weren't just about pests or smell. They were also believed to shape the temperament of the sleeper. Lavender was calming, said to still a restless mind. Rosemary was invigorating, suitable for those whose duties called for early rising. Mugwort, used in lesser-known traditions, was even said to induce vivid dreams or visions. So the bed became a stage where scent, sleep, and spirit intertwined. Now imagine winter in a medieval longhouse. The roof leaks a little. Smoke curls from the central hearth. The wind howls like a hungry beast just beyond the thatched walls. But inside, beneath thick woolen covers, a child lies still. Beneath him, the mattress is firm with straw, and woven through it, a quilt of crushed herbs warms the air around his face. He smells lavender and mint. The insects, cold or repelled, leave him alone for the night. He dreams of bread and bright days, and maybe that's enough. Even nobles took part in this herb-scented bedding culture. Castle chambers, though far grander than peasant huts, were not immune to lice and fleas. Rich tapestries could harbor as many pests as a straw mattress, and so the nobility developed even more elaborate solutions. Herbal mattresses in castles might include more exotic ingredients, cinnamon bark, cloves, or imported spices from distant ports. These weren't just comforts. They were symbols of status and attempts at control over a natural world that stubbornly refused to be tamed. And as with all things medieval, the line between cleanliness, magic, and medicine blurred. A bed that smelled of rosemary wasn't just nice, it was protective. A mattress with rue and hyssop might ward off plague. Sleep itself became an act of spiritual and physical maintenance, and herbs were the quiet sentinels guarding each slumbering body. In times of illness or fear, beds were refreshed with feverfew and yarrow. When childbirth loomed, chamomile and motherwort were added to the bedding, sometimes soaked in wine and dried first to strengthen the heart. Nothing in the medieval world was done without reason. And so we return to this strangely intimate detail of history: a mattress, lumpy and rustling with straw, filled not just with the raw materials of rest, but with plants chosen for their power to heal, repel, and comfort. While today we rely on synthetic fabrics, sealed windows, and factory-made pest control, the medieval sleeper placed their trust in leaves and blossoms, grown under sun and rain, dried by hand, and laid beneath their body as a nightly shield. And as sleep arrived, with its thick velvet hush, those herbs performed their quiet magic, unseen but ever present. Their scents might drift upward into dreams, or linger in the seams of a blanket. A defense, a ritual, a kind of bedtime story, whispered by crushed rosemary, an ancient tradition. In a world where so little could be controlled, this fragrant patch of peace was something they could count on. There was no hum of refrigeration in the medieval world, no mechanical whir behind a closed door filled with light and freon, no reliable chill to trust your milk to, and certainly no plastic-wrapped convenience from a supermarket shelf. But despite this, people in the Middle Ages had to preserve food just the same, and they did so using a wide range of clever, earthy, and often very quiet techniques. One of the most unexpectedly ingenious methods was what we now call the stone slab fridge, although to them, it had no such label. It was simply a matter of reading the environment, of knowing that certain stones, placed in certain positions, did a better job at holding in the cold, even in warm months. Most homes in medieval villages didn't have cellars, but they knew how to improvise. Flat stone slabs, often large pieces of slate, granite, or even layered limestone, would be installed or placed in the coolest, shadiest part of the house. This was usually the north-facing wall, often close to the floor, or right along the edge of where the building kissed the earth. These slabs were naturally cold because of how they conducted and held temperature, and families would place perishables directly on top of them: bowls of cream, wedges of cheese, cured meats, root vegetables, and even jugs of ale or water that needed to stay cool. Sometimes these slabs were hollowed slightly to form shallow basins that could be lined with straw or wool, or even moist moss materials that helped insulate the item from ambient warmth and, paradoxically, kept it cooler longer. In particularly lucky households, the stone slab was built directly above a patch of earth that had been dug out slightly, creating a small cavity of cold air trapped beneath it. This subterranean feature acted almost like a primitive thermos, leveraging the earth's natural insulation. Food placed on these slabs would last noticeably longer than it would anywhere else in the home. A difference measured not just in comfort or preference, but in survival. In summer, when dairy curdled in a matter of hours, and meat invited flies like kings to a feast, the stone slab became sacred ground, the one surface you didn't waste. But there was more to it than just the stone. Families learned over time that if you cooled the stone first, yes, by placing pots of cold water or snow upon it overnight, if you had access, could act like a thermal battery. By the morning, the stone would be several degrees cooler than the room, and whatever was placed on it absorbed that cold like a blessing. Children were often tasked with fetching the cool water early in the morning and gently pouring it along grooves in the slab, which had been chiseled out to direct runoff and evaporative chill. In some households, older generations had passed down the custom of wrapping small jars in soaked cloth and placing them on the slab. As the water evaporated from the cloth, it carried away heat, creating a cooling effect, not unlike what we call evaporative refrigeration today. These tricks were not theoretical. They were born from the tight grip of necessity. A spoiled piece of meat was not just unpleasant, could be dangerous. A ruined batch of milk meant the loss of labor, resources, and nutrition. So the stone slab wasn't just a place, it was a system. People built habits around it. They learned to rotate food, carefully put the fresher milk in back, the older, near the front. They learned to monitor the temperature by touch or smell. They didn't have thermometers, but they had fingers and noses trained by repetition. If the cheese softened too quickly, they knew the weather was shifting. If the butter slumped by mid-morning, they brought out extra moss. During colder months, the slab took on a different purpose. In winter, when the house might be bitterly cold and water froze in the bucket, the slab could actually become too cold. So it would be lined with straw to gently buffer sensitive foods from freezing, because oddly enough, freezing wasn't always desired. Root vegetables, in particular, could turn to mush if allowed to freeze and thaw too often. So even in cold seasons, the medieval peasant became a temperature manager, not just fighting heat, but also modulating cold. This nuanced understanding of thermal behavior came without any textbooks, just oral tradition and trial by frostbite. Some more advanced households or wealthier manor kitchens took the stone slab concept further. They carved shallow niches into thick stone walls, especially those on the north side of a building. These recessed shelves acted like early refrigerators. The thick stone not only stayed cool all day, it also shaded whatever was placed inside. Doors, sometimes just a wooden shutter, could be added to keep insects and animals out, though even without a seal, the temperature inside these niches was considerably lower than the room. These stone wall fridges often held the most precious or vulnerable items: a pot of cream, a special honey cake, or even medical salves that spoiled in the heat. For some monasteries, where dietary rules and medicinal storage were essential, this knowledge was recorded and shared through practical manuals, many of which never survived the centuries. In peasant homes, it was all memory grandmothers teaching daughters, fathers carving the slab with care, and young children learning how to balance a jug on the edge without spilling the precious milk. Stone slabs were also used as resting places for bread dough, especially in hot months. If left on a table, dough might ferment too quickly or develop off flavors, but resting it on a cool slab gave the baker more control. A slower rise meant better flavor and texture. Some even claimed that stone imparted a purer, cleaner taste to certain foods, though whether that was fact or folklore didn't matter. In a world where superstition and science braided themselves together, the slab held symbolic power too. In a few rural areas, it was considered unlucky to place raw meat on the slab after dark, for fear that spirits might spoil it. So people worked within daylight, within rhythm, within memory. Some households built benches or stools beside the slab knot because they were resting. But because tending to the fridge required attention, you didn't just leave food there and forget it. You checked it, you sniffed, rotated, wiped, adjusted. You responded to the weather, to the season, even to the behaviors of mice or bugs. A mother might sit and shell peas while keeping one eye on the butter pot, her fingers and instincts honed by years of practice. And for all its simplicity, the stone slab worked. In fact, many of these slabs survived the centuries. Archaeologists often uncover them in old cottages' thick, worn stone platforms nestled into corners or under former hearths, sometimes with the smooth dips where generations of pots once rested. They are silent records of resilience, memorials to an era when people managed life without the slightest hum of machinery. To modernize, they might look like crude counters or remnants of a demolished wall, but to medieval families, they were the cool heart of the home. They held the line between nourishment and decay, between full bellies and waste, between survival and sickness. And in the quiet chill of early dawn, as barefoot children crept through the cottage and mothers checked the milk, the stone slab stood cold and still, a medieval miracle of patience, stone, and skill. Cabbage in the modern world is often underestimated. A leafy vegetable pushed to the edges of plates, chopped into salads, or simmered into soups. But in the medieval imagination, it was more than food. It was fabric, it was balm, it was poultice, and sometimes it was armor. Medieval households, especially those of peasants or lower gentry, often treated cabbage not merely as a crop, but as a quiet, green companion to their health. A good cabbage could survive a chill, a poor harvest, and even being stored half-frozen under a pile of straw, but its value only increased when you got sick or sore. one of the most curious and oddly touching medieval survival techniques involved. The direct application of cabbage leaves to the human body, wrapped around aching joints, bruised limbs, and inflamed skin. This wasn't fringe folk. Magic it was a method used across Europe for centuries, passed from mother to daughter, from herbalist to apprentice, not with mystical chants, but with nods of hard-earned experience. If your knees were swollen from tilling the fields for 12 hours straight, or your arms ached from chopping wood until the sun blinked out behind the hills, you might find relief not from a physician who you could never afford, but from a leaf of cabbage boiled soft and wrapped around your injury with linen or even bark fiber string. The leaf had to be softened, just enough not so raw it snapped, not so boiled it lost its sturdiness. Ideally, it was massaged slightly or bruised by hand to release its juices. Why cabbage? Because even if they didn't know the modern words for it, like anti-inflammatory or phytochemical, people had figured out through centuries of quiet, aching trial and error that something in cabbage soothed. Some medieval herbals hinted at this vaguely. Speaking of the cooling quality of cabbage, or its ability to draw out humors, others were more confident. Hildegard of Bingen, the famous 12th century abbess, wrote extensively about cabbage's healing uses in her medical treatises. She suggested it not only for skin afflictions, but for infections and digestive complaints. When cut into strips and lightly warmed by the fire, cabbage could be laid across the stomach to settle cramps, or across a chest racked by cough. Some midwives even used it postpartum, pressing boiled leaves over the abdomen or breasts to reduce swelling or calm fevers. In castles, cabbage wasn't likely the first tool of healing, but in the huts and cottages of commoners, it was cheap medicine, with roots in dirt and sky. The process of making a cabbage leaf bandage was a kind of ritual, slow and deliberate, often carried out in silence in the candle glow of the hearth. The leaf would be chosen carefully, no tears, no rot, not too old and leathery, not too young and papery. It would be washed in water from the well, perhaps with a bit of vinegar or wine if the housewife had some to spare. Then it was steamed over the fire, sometimes wrapped in linen and warmed with the coals, and finally applied to the wound or ache. If someone was lucky enough to own a bit of linen or flax gauze, the leaf would be bound snugly in place. If not, an old threadbare scarf, or even a woven grass strip would do. Over the hours, the cabbage leaf would darken, its once bright green becoming dull, limp, and bruised from contact with the body's inflammation. Some families believed the darker the leaf became, the more illness it had drawn out. In some cases, the leaf was replaced every few hours for a full day, as though it were a sponge soaking up invisible poison. There were even records of it being used on infected wounds where the skin was broken, though this was riskier. And not all lived to speak of whether cabbage helped or hurt. In winter, cabbage leaf, first aid, became almost sacred. Root cellars were checked regularly to make sure the cabbages hadn't rotted or frozen through. Because they weren't just food, they were the only compress most villagers could count on. When a grandmother fell on the ice, or a child came back from sledding with a twisted ankle, it was to the cabbage that the family turned, not to doctors. Medical practitioners of the time, those trained by monasteries or universities, might scoff at such practices in their writings. But even they would sometimes prescribe cabbage poultices, hedging their language carefully to stay within accepted Galenic theories of the body's humors. More often than not, they'd recommend it alongside a bloodletting or a purgative, but in the practical world of villagers who didn't have time or coin for such rituals, cabbage leaf treatment was simple, direct, and at least made you feel like you were doing something. Interestingly, there was variation in cabbage usage, depending on region and climate. In Northern Europe, particularly in colder regions of England, Scotland, and Scandinavia, the more rugged cabbages were preferred tightly curled, thick-leaved varieties that could hold heat longer and didn't wilt after a single boil. In southern climates, like Italy or the Iberian Peninsula, softer-leafed versions were used more frequently and often blended with herbs like rosemary, sage, or even garlic to increase their medicinal power. Garlic and cabbage, when mashed together and smeared over inflamed joints, was a powerful, if pungent, remedy against gout and stiffness. There are records from 13th century Spain noting cabbage compresses left overnight for arthritis sufferers, with some describing the next morning's smell as something between a feast and a battlefield. Beyond injuries, cabbage leaves found their way into the treatment of fevers and rashes. Mothers wrapped children in cabbage compresses during fevers, believing the coolness of the leaves would pull out the fire. In some villages, cabbage leaf wraps were used during the packs, though there was great superstition around this, and it had to be done exactly right. First, the left leg, then the right, then both arms, then finally the chest, with a prayer muttered as each limb was wrapped. If the sequence was wrong, it was said, the disease might get confused and spread to the eyes or tongue. There's something deeply human and almost poignant in imagining these scenes, families gathered around the hearth. The crackle of fire, a pot steaming with cabbage, not for stew, but for healing, a child crying, soot-streaked, bundled in itchy wool, holding still while a parent carefully winds warm cabbage around a swollen wrist, or a bent old farmer, his back curved like a question mark from years of labor, leaning over a table while his wife ties steaming green leaves to his knees and mutters under her breath about how he never listens and always lists more than he should. This was survival not through might, but through repetition, care, and green persistence. The cabbage leaf was not a miracle, but, in the absence of miracles, it was better than nothing. And sometimes, in the cold hush of winter or the thick buzzing of summer heat, it was enough to dull the pain, enough to give the illusion of healing, which in desperate times can be its own kind of magic. Even today, echoes of this technique survive. Some naturopaths and midwives still recommend cabbage compresses for mastitis in breastfeeding women, or for joint swelling. There's modern science, too, now investigating the anti-inflammatory compounds in brassicas, the cabbage family, and finding that maybe those medieval peasants weren't entirely wrong. Maybe their leaf-wrapped knees and their soot-scrubbed hands weren't just fumbling in darkness, but grasping, slowly and instinctively, toward truths that science would later name. So next time you pass by a cabbage in a grocery store, better yet, grow one in a garden, pause for a moment. Picture not a salad, but a survival tool, steaming quietly on a wooden table while outside frost grips the earth, and inside, a tired body breathes just a little easier, held gently in the arms of something green and old and ordinary. Long before the flick of a light switch or the gentle hum of a bulb filled a room with warmth, the medieval night was a place of flickering shadows, deep silence, and the occasional squeal of something unseen scuttling in the rafters. Darkness wasn't just inconvenient, it was downright dangerous. So how did ordinary people illuminate their homes without oil lamps, lanterns, or wax candles, which were expensive and mostly reserved for churches and wealthy households? Enter one of the most forgotten yet brilliant hacks in medieval survival, the rushlight, sometimes called the bacon torch. Imagine a simple reed, yes, a swamp reed dipped into pig fat, then left to dry. Light one end, and congratulations, you've just invented your very own poor man's torch. But there's far more to this than crude fire sticks. The rushlight was a symbol of thrift, domestic ingenuity, and the resourcefulness bred by necessity. These humble lights were made by first harvesting the rushes themselves, typically from marshes or riverbanks. You had to know the right season, usually midsummer, when the stalks were firm but not brittle. People would wade into the mucky water, barefoot, baskets slung over their backs, cutting long green rushes by hand. The work was cold, itchy, and often involved dodging leeches, but the payoff was illumination. Once the rushes were gathered, they were peeled, carefully slicing away 3/4 of the tough green skin to expose the spongy white pith inside. This core was the real magic. It acted like a wick, but with far more personality. Then came the fat, and not just any fat. Had to be rendered animal fat, often pork lard, sheep tallow, or beef suet. Bacon drippings were prized because they offered a slower burn, and, curiously, a lingering meaty aroma that made homes smell vaguely like breakfast, even at midnight. The reeds were soaked in the warm fat, absorbing it like a dry sponge until they were saturated. Then they were laid out to dry and harden. Once cooled, they were ready to light. A rushlight could burn for about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on length, thickness, and how much fat it held. That doesn't sound like much, but they were often lit in sequence, a bundle of rushes kept nearby, rotated like medieval batteries. Some clever households even built wooden holders to angle them just right, often using split logs or clay stands to tilt them and catch drips. The flame was weak compared to a modern candle, more like a glowing ember clinging to life, but it was enough to see a wooden spoon, thread a needle, or avoid stepping on the family cat. They weren't safe by modern standards, of course. A forgotten rushlight could set fire to straw mattresses, linens, or even a thatched roof if mounted carelessly. Stories survive of villages nearly burned down by a sleeping servant, forgetting to snuff one out. In fact, some medieval towns began to limit their use indoors, especially in upper rooms. But that didn't stop people. These lights were often the only affordable option. Candle wax came from bees, which were precious and took time to cultivate. Tallow candles were thicker and brighter, but again, costlier. Rushlights were for everyone else, the peasants, shepherds, midwives, and aging grandmothers who still sat up late by the hearth. And despite their simplicity, there was something ceremonial about lighting them. Families gathered at dusk, and lighting a rushlight often marked the beginning of quiet time, the slow descent into evening prayer, mending, quiet conversation, or storytelling. In winter, when days were short and nights long, households burned dozens a week. Children were sometimes given the task of trimming or making rushlights, which taught them patience and care. There were even quiet competitions whose rush burned brightest, whose lasted longest, whose smelled least like wet bacon. Some households experimented with herbs in the fat lavender, thyme, or mint to mask the animal odor and offer something like scented ambience. Imagine a 14th century peasant home. The beams low, the walls wattle and daub, the air thick with the scent of smoke, cooked root vegetables, and burning fat. A single rushlight in the center casts shadows that dance across the walls. A father sharpens tools. A mother stitches torn linen. Children huddle under itchy wool blankets. Outside, wolves howl in the distance, and the frost thickens. But inside, this tiny flame fed by pig fat and ingenuity keeps the dark at bay. And yet the rushlight wasn't only used indoors. Travelers carried them, merchants burned them late at stalls, and rural monks used them during long vigils. They were so common in some regions that entire bundles were sold at market, like firewood. Some even say the phrase burning the candle at both ends comes from the twin-ended rushlight, which could be lit on both sides to have burn time. For double light, a desperate but occasionally necessary trick when work needed finishing before sunrise. In certain places, rushlights were used ritually lit during childbirth, vigil prayers, or morning rites. The idea was that the light, born from the earth, rushes, and the body fat, represented both life and death. When it died out, it signaled closure. And what's fascinating is that rushlights lingered long past the medieval era. Even as oil lamps and paraffin took over rural families in parts of Ireland, Wales, and northern England continued to use them well into the 19th century. Old books even describe detailed recipes for crafting the perfect rushlight, down to which rush species burned smoothest. Today, if you tried to make one, you'd be engaging in an ancient art of light crafting, passed down by nameless hands through centuries of smoke and silence. We forget how recent our comfort is. The luxury of reaching out in the dark and simply flipping a switch would be beyond imagining for the average medieval family. For them, fire was life-cooked food, warm beds, protection from predators, and the only thing that could pierce the pitch-black countryside once the sun dipped below the trees. And the rushlight, as small and smoky as it was, stood bravely between people and the encroaching dark. A flickering flame born of swamp reeds and bacon grease. It was ugly, yes, but utterly beautiful in its purpose. It was survival by glow, one flicker at a time. Despite the widespread myth that medieval people lived in a haze of unending filth and chaos, the reality, though not exactly pristine, was deeply practical, with survival techniques tucked into every corner of the home, including those often overlooked, like the pantry or cold storage. Now, imagine this. You've churned your butter from fresh milk, an exhausting but rewarding task, only to realize it needs to stay cool, firm, and edible for as long as possible. There's no electricity, no refrigeration, no humming box of cold air to rely on. So what does a savvy medieval homemaker do? You look to the north side of your home, the side least touched by the sun. There, embedded into a wall, or tucked into the floor, near thick stone, lies the coldest place available. The medieval pantry, or buttery, where the temperature stayed surprisingly low, even during summer. But the coolest part wasn't just the stone, it was the spiderwebs. Yes, spiders were not only tolerated in pantries, but sometimes outright welcomed. This wasn't because medieval people were fond of eight-legged roommates, but because spiders served an unspoken yet critical role. Pest control. The same flies, moths, and beetles that would have delighted in nibbling through your cured meats, cheese, and precious butter were kept at bay by those diligent web spinners hanging silently in the corners. It was a kind of symbiotic truce. Spiders received a steady diet, and the family got relatively cleaner food. When flies buzzed into the storage area, they'd often get caught in the invisible netting laid out by the household's natural pest patrol. And since flies could carry disease or accelerate spoilage, their absence wasn't just nice, it was life-extending. But it didn't stop at spiders. The placement of cold storage areas was a carefully calculated decision based on centuries of observation. North-facing walls absorbed the least sunlight. Thick stone construction, especially if partially subterranean, acted as a natural insulator. And in many homes, these pantries were not built separately, but carved into the shaded heart of the dwelling, surrounded by earthen floors or deep clay walls that leached heat away from their contents. Inside, you'd find hanging shelves carved from wood, often elevated from the ground, not just to keep away mice and bugs, but to avoid contact with dampness rising from below. Sometimes, slabs of slate or marble were set into wooden surfaces, to provide a chill platform for particularly perishable goods like fresh milk, fish, or you guessed it, butter. In more humid regions, families would go a step further by wrapping dairy in linen soaked in vinegar or brine and storing it in clay pots, which were then kept on the cold shelf or even buried halfway into the floor for extra cooling power. Butter, when wrapped and packed properly, could last longer than one might assume, sometimes over a week in cool conditions, and longer still if turned into clarified butter or ghee. But even with all that caution, spoilage was always a threat. Thus, timing was everything. Butter-making days were chosen carefully to align with milk supply and household usage. Excess butter was often salted, molded into dense shapes, and stored in lidded ceramic crocks, sealed with beeswax or animal fat, creating an airtight layer. Even in the most humble cottages, someone always knew how to stretch perishables just a few days longer, skills passed down like heirlooms. However, even with these tricks, not all intrusions could be avoided. Mice, in particular, were tenacious, able to chew through wood, leather, and even soft stone. This meant many pantries had to be hung with food items suspended from beams via ropes or chains, and clever deterrents like oiled cords, inverted metal cones, or even sharp herbs were used to discourage climbing invaders. Cats, too, earned their keep, here not merely as companions, but as frontline defenders of the medieval pantry. You can imagine a child scolded for chasing a cat away from the buttery, not because of superstition, but because that feline was worth its weight in saved food. Now, back to the butter. Texture mattered. Medieval people didn't just want it cold, they needed it firm enough to spread on rough bread, to use in pastry or fry onions, and to act as a calorie-dense lifesaver during lean seasons. Cold butter was a blessing. Melted or rancid butter was a tragedy. The phrase butter wouldn't melt in their mouth might sound quaint now, but back then, melted butter in the mouth meant it was probably too warm in the pantry, and that meant something was going wrong. Some households even placed carved butter in shallow bowls of cool water, shaded by linen cloth, creating a rudimentary water bath refrigeration system. Wealthier homes had access to spring houses, little buildings built over cold flowing streams, where milk jugs and butter pots could be submerged to stay fresh longer. The really fortunate might have access to ice pits, where blocks of frozen river ice were dragged into stone chambers in winter and covered with sawdust to last until summer. But this was rare outside estates or monasteries. Most families relied on their north-facing pantry, and trusted their spiders to keep the shelves from crawling with uninvited guests. It wasn't uncommon for a person to refer to the pantry spiders by name, or at least let them remain unbothered, so long as they kept the place livable. There's even evidence in folklore and manuscript marginalia of a strange kind of affection for these silent guardians of the butter, sometimes shown with little hats, or referenced as lucky if seen near the bread box. That said, not all webs were tolerated. Too many webs could signal neglect. A careful balance had to be struck. A few elegant webs in the corners meant nature was helping. Thick cobwebs across the shelves meant the kitchen maid needed to pick up a broom. One traveler's diary from the late 1300s describes stopping at a roadside inn in France and remarking not on the beds or beer, but on how the larder was shaded and clean, the cheeses hung high, and the butter firm and cool. A review that essentially meant, "This place won't poison you." It's telling that in a world of unpredictable seasons, failing harvests, and no preservatives, one of the clearest signs of competence was the state of your butter. So the next time you see a spider in your kitchen and instinctively reach for a slipper or rolled newspaper, consider this. Once upon a time, that little creature was as valued as a lock on the pantry door, a secret ally to a medieval cook trying to keep her butter solid and her family alive. The partnership between stone, shadow, web, and fat was a quiet, practical alliance and celebrated, yet fundamental. A survival trick hidden in plain sight, made not of spells or swords, but of bricks, bugs, and butter. While we tend to imagine medieval towns as places where food either grew in far-off fields or was handed out in bustling markets, the reality is that for many common people, particularly the urban, poor survival often meant finding sustenance in the most unexpected of places, and sometimes that place was the roof above their own heads. Yes, in certain cramped quarters of medieval towns, especially in regions like northern France, parts of Germany, and late medieval England, people began cultivating edible plants in the gutters, ledges, and eaves of their homes. Gutter gardens, as they might anachronistically be called, were not part of some whimsical medieval eco-design, but rather a desperate and quietly ingenious solution to a persistent and very real problem. There simply wasn't enough space, with streets crowded, yards reduced to muddy pens, and every square inch of ground space contested between livestock, firewood stacks, and communal pathways. Some inventive households realized that their rooftops, particularly the large thatch-covered ones, could provide a bit of vertical relief in a tightly packed world. Rain gutters carved out of split timber or hammered iron wood collect not just rainwater, but also silt, feathers, soot, and the occasional decomposing leaf. Over time, this gunk would congeal into a layer of soil-like material, just thick enough to cradle seeds, whether deliberately planted or simply fallen from kitchen waste thrown out upper-story windows. Birds, too, played a part, inadvertently depositing seeds from wild herbs and grains as they perched and preened on rooftops. What began as accidental sprouts were soon noticed, encouraged, and eventually cultivated. Households started nudging this rooftop detritus into little channels, using sticks and broken roof tiles to hold the sludge in place. Some even mixed in soot from the hearth or droppings from the loft chickens to enhance fertility. The plants grown were typically small and hardy: chives, parsley, mustard greens, chickweed, purslane, thyme, and, in some cases, creeping strawberries. These were not crops for feasts, but rather survival accents, flavor boosts for otherwise bland gruels, or vitamin-rich garnishes to fend off deficiencies. For the poor, a handful of gutter-grown parsley could mean the difference between another tasteless pottage and something vaguely satisfying. Children were often tasked with maintaining these high gardens, crawling onto the roof with small baskets or scraps of cloth tied around their waists to gather the delicate leaves. These expeditions required a blend of courage and clumsiness that only a nimble 8-year-old could possess, particularly when balancing on thatch under a sky filled with soot and pigeons. Occasionally, a larger plant like sorrel would thrive so enthusiastically in a rain-drenched eave that neighbors would lean from their upper windows with knives, slicing off portions in the medieval equivalent of rooftop foraging. And while these gutter gardens were never officially seconded, they were often considered nuisances by civic authorities worried about drainage. They became quietly essential in some quarters. Priests might grumble that these sky plots encouraged sloth or pride, but mothers with 5 children and a single turnip saw them as salvation. Of course, there were hazards. The buildup of organic matter sometimes blocked the flow of water, causing leaks or structural rot. In winter, frozen soil could break tiles or warp beams, leading to expensive repairs. But such risks were weighed against hunger, and for those whose pantries were often bare, it was an easy gamble. There's even evidence from surviving wills and household records that suggests families might have passed down certain rooftop plots. The way they would a corner cupboard or a footstool as a valuable household fixture. A particularly sunny gutter with excellent drainage might have been boasted about, even quietly envied. Marjorie's got the thyme sprouting again, one might mutter as they stirred cabbage soup with bare roots from last month's frostbitten harvest. Over time, some towns began regulating rooftop access, not because of the gardens, per se, but due to the sheer number of people now regularly climbing atop buildings. There were falls, of course, and injuries, and even one notorious case in Bruges where a man fell into a chimney while trying to water his rooftop spinach. Such incidents inspired crude rhymes, cautionary tales, and eventually, rooftop rails or ladders fixed in place by thoughtful tinkerers. It is hard to imagine today just how significant a few leafy greens could feel to someone who had gone months without tasting freshness. No refrigeration meant herbs and leaves had to be picked and consumed within hours, and the convenience of growing them just feet above your bed was irresistible. Some enterprising women even grew herbs that doubled as medicine: feverfew, plantain, ruand, from these modest sky patches, concocted salves, tonics, and teas. These remedies, passed down orally and through scribbled household manuals, became lifelines in seasons when actual doctors were either unavailable or completely unaffordable. The sight of a green sprig bobbing from a corner gutter became oddly reassuring in a world of gray mud and soot. In some regions, especially mountainous towns with steeply pitched roofs, the idea evolved further. People began hanging baskets from rafters or constructing shelf-like ledges below windows' primitive window. Boxes where strawberries or lettuces could catch morning sun. These elevated kitchen gardens became small shrines to domestic hope, dotting the skyline with humble symbols of resistance to scarcity. Even when the food grown was negligible in calories, the psychological benefit was immense. A single clump of sage or mint could inspire a recipe, turn a watery broth into soup, or lend courage to an ill child refusing another bland spoonful. There's even reason to believe that some forms of culinary creativities, certain herbs, breads or vinegars originated in these accidental gardens, where necessity and chance gave birth to innovation. It's strange, in a way, that we often picture medieval food culture as strictly earthbound, rooted in tilled soil and farm plots, when so many people lived without access to either. For them, survival meant redefining where food could grow, and sometimes that meant looking up instead of down. So, the next time you pass an overgrown rain gutter or see a patch of moss sprouting from the edge of a roof, remember, in another time, in another age, someone might have climbed up there, not to clear it, but to harvest their dinner. A little sky, a little soil, and a little stubbornness, that was the recipe, in the endless tug-of-war between human hunger and opportunistic rodents. Medieval peasants devised surprisingly clever methods to keep their hard-won food safe from nibbling intruders. Among the more quietly ingenious of these was the use of suspended food storage, a method that not only reveals the scarcity and desperation of the time, but also their keen observational intelligence. You see, long before steel latches, modern refrigeration, or even proper wooden cupboards, villagers had to wage a nightly war against mice and rats that roamed the earthen floors of their cottages with the impunity of seasoned burglars. These creatures, emboldened by centuries of domesticated living, would nibble through sacks of grain, ruin strips of dried meat, and even gnaw through firewood if the scent of fat had lingered on the handle of a cooking pot. So what was a resourceful medieval householder to do? The answer, as it often was, came from simplicity, born of survival. Suspend it all from the ceiling, using cords woven from flax or twisted horsehair, or sometimes even braided nettles. villagers would carefully tie up bundles of dried herbs, strings of onions, wheels of cheese, and cured meats, hanging them from beams overhead or from specially fitted pegs that protruded downward like miniature gallows. This wasn't just to keep the food out of reach, but to make the entire affair into a swaying, inaccessible island, far removed from the hungry scurry of paws below. Mice could climb. Of course they were agile, clever, and utterly determined, but the addition of one more element made these suspended stores particularly cunning. The mouse deterrent collar, fashioned from upturned potsherds, small discs of polished wood, or in some regions, even repurposed pieces of horn or shell. These guards would be fitted around the cord itself, just above the food bundle. The idea was that if a mouse did manage to scamper down the cord, it would meet a slick, slippery, or sharply angled surface it couldn't bypass, and would slide off or be forced to retreat. Some of these devices were elaborately carved or glazed, suggesting that over time they became a point of both function and household pride. A good food suspension system not only fed your family through winter, it also signaled to visitors that you had mastered the ancient and respectable art of mouseproofing. This ceiling-based storage had another advantage too. It kept food away from the damp ground, where moisture, mold, and mildew were constant threats, especially in homes with packed earth floors that grew clammy during wet seasons. In fact, villagers often chose their hanging spots carefully to catch the rising warmth of the hearth, letting gentle smoke and residual heat help keep the items dry and insect-free. Cured meats in particular benefited from this placement, drying out into hard, long-lasting hunks that could be sliced thin and boiled when needed. In some regions, entire lattice systems of beams were built overhead in cottages, not just to support the roof, but to double as massive pantry racks, from which all sorts of items would dangle in a culinary canopy: sausages strung in loops, smoked fish crusted with salt, braided garlic like shriveled white flowers, and even pouches of seeds or lentils tied tightly in cloth. A visitor entering such a space would find themselves ducking beneath a forest of edible mobiles, a humble and fragrant chandelier of survival. And yet the ingenuity didn't stop at the cord. Some people tied bells onto the ends of the ropestini, ones often made of scrap bronze or a twisted wire, that would jingle if the food started to sway. This wasn't to announce dinner time, but to warn of thieves, both four-legged and two. A nighttime creak of a rope or the subtle ring of a bell could wake a light sleeper who would sit bolt upright under wool blankets, straining their ears to detect whether the sound was merely the wind or something trying to steal the last of the winter ham. This subtle form of medieval alarm system came to be especially valued in times of famine, where a chunk of cheese or a handful of barley was worth guarding, like treasure. In wealthier peasant homes or in monasteries that doubled as food storage facilities, these suspended systems could become incredibly complex, with pulley mechanisms to raise or lower food from great heights, allowing monks or cooks to preserve delicacies without risking contamination. It wasn't uncommon in northern European homes for food to be hoisted into high attics via rope and pulley, kept dry and away from pests, and retrieved only when required, giving a peculiar, ceremonial air to something as simple as breakfast porridge. Children, growing up in these homes, often learned from a young age how to tie the correct knots, how to balance the weight of hanging bundles so they didn't tilt and spill, and how to oil the rope with tallow or resin to keep bugs from crawling up. Some even treated the food rope as part of their bedtime rituals, one last inspection before sleep, making sure the bacon hadn't slipped or the oat sack wasn't unraveling. All part of the dance of survival. Even beyond the home, this method extended into barns and storage huts, where hay was sometimes hung in high-netted slings to keep it from rotting and to ensure that the best parts of the harvest didn't mold away in damp corners. On the sea, sailors used similar principles to hang dried fish or hard biscuits in the ship's hold, hoisting them above the ratline like edible lifeboats, and over time, hanging food became so synonymous with foresight and frugality that it entered folklore. In some parts of medieval Germany, there was a saying that a wise wife's roof grows roots of bread, meaning that the truly prudent household would always have something edible tucked safely out of reach, like fruit growing from the rafters. In extreme cases, this form of storage even saved lives. when a plague or siege swept through a village, and markets were shuttered and pantries raided. Families who had the forethought to hide food above head height, tucked in the thatch or beneath the eaves, often found themselves with an unexpected reserve smoked herring wrapped in cloth, or a dried apple tucked inside a hollow gourd, forgotten for months but still edible. These modest, swaying bundles weren't just food, they were time capsules of resilience, swinging reminders of human cleverness in the face of constant hunger. And as unlikely as it may seem to us today, walking into a medieval cottage and seeing food hanging from every beam would have been not just normal, it would have been comforting, a visible map of survival sketched in knots, hooks, and twine. The idea of washing your clothes in stale human urine may strike the modern mind as something between repulsive and utterly incomprehensible. But for much of the medieval world, this was not only a common practice, it was the standard for removing stains, whitening linen, and achieving that elusive thing we might now call hygiene. It begins, as all practical things do, in the Middle Ages, with a need and a lack. The need to clean clothes that were often stained with sweat, dirt, blood, or soot, and the lack of industrial soap, washing machines, or the vast network of detergents we take for granted. In this setting, full of biological mess and rustic improvisation, people began collecting what they had in surplus, bodily fluids. Chief among them was what was known euphemistically as chamber lye, essentially stale urine aged until the ammonia levels became powerful enough to lift grease, oil, and protein stains from textiles. Families would collect it in buckets or pots, storing it outside until it had matured, aged like a fine wine, at which point it transformed into an incredibly effective degreaser and fabric whitener. Urine contains urea, and when left to sit, it breaks down into ammonia, a potent alkaline substance that can strip organic matter from fabric. In fact, if you've ever used a powerful kitchen cleaner that smells slightly like a hospital hallway, chances are it's based on ammonia. But imagine using that, unrefined and sharp, gathered from your entire household's chamber pots, to soak your undergarments in. This process wasn't just a peasant's trick, either across medieval Europe, particularly in Britain, Italy, and parts of France. Even semi-affluent households would set aside a special wash urine pot, often labeled with an L for lye. Laundresses, those professionals who scrubbed, boiled, and beat garments into semi-submission, would trudge around with buckets full of linen, water, and yes, human waste, heading for communal washhouses or riverside stones. There, the fabrics were soaked in urine, then agitated, sometimes with bare feet, much like grapes for wine, before being scrubbed on wooden boards or simply battered against large stones until the dirt surrendered. This was often followed by a boiling rinse in fresh water, usually mixed with herbs like sage, mint, or lavender. Not for antibacterial purposes, though that helped, but simply to cover the odor of what had come before. And it must be said, once washed and dried, garments didn't retain the smell of the urine, much like modern ammonia-based cleaning. The scent evaporated once fully dried, though the psychological aroma likely lingered among those who knew how the sausage was made, so to speak. But this wasn't only about laundry. In medieval textile industries, even then urine was used at scale in the processing of wool and the preparation of cloth for dyeing. Fullers, for instance, were tradesmen who thickened and cleaned woolen cloth, and one of their principal tools was human urine. Fulling mills existed throughout Europe and even parts of the Islamic world, and they relied on a constant, industrial flow of the stuff. In some cities, citizens were even encouraged to urinate into public jars or collection pots to help supply the local fulling mill. The smell around these places was said to be unimaginable. But this isn't just hearsay. The practice was so common and economically significant that when ancient Romans ruled Britain, they taxed urine collection. That's right, Emperor Vespasian famously instituted a urine tax, and some of that Roman habit trickled down, pardon the pun, into medieval sensibilities. So if you think medieval folk were just primitive or unclean, remember, they were repurposing waste long before we had the language of sustainability, and unlike today, they didn't have an option. Medieval soap, when available, was usually lye-based. made from wood, ash, and animal fat, but it was labor-intensive and expensive. Urine was free, effective, and required no processing, just time and a strong stomach. In some households, especially poorer ones, it doubled as a stain pre-treatment and a sort of general-purpose cleanser. Urine was even used to clean leather, polish armor, and soak tools in before repairs. But back to the laundry, there was a rhythm and social structure to it. Wash day wasn't a daily task, but a major event, often scheduled once a fortnight or even monthly. Clothes would be sorted, soaked, and washed communally, usually near streams or designated washing areas. Women sang songs to pass the time, some of which hilariously referenced the stink. And while boiling clothes was a later and rarer addition, because firewood was scarce and boiling meant higher risk of ruining cloth, rinsing and beating were considered absolutely essential. Some regions added special touches. In parts of Scandinavia, after the urine wash, people used snow or cold water as a whitening agent, laying their linens out under the sky to be bleached by the sun and air. In the British Isles, some added clay or chalk in the final rinse to help brighten linens further. These weren't random tricks, they were folk science, honed over generations by observation, repetition, and, presumably, a lot of trial and error. Sometimes vinegar was used to neutralize lingering alkalinity. Sometimes herbs were tucked into the folds of freshly washed garments, not just for scent, but as pest repellents. And the process didn't stop at washing. Drying, too, was deliberate. Clothes were laid across bushes, fences, or special wooden frames, sometimes rotated toward the sun. If it rained well, everything was washed again. And so you can imagine, this wasn't just laundry. It was life maintenance, taking up entire days and requiring significant collective effort. The use of urine as a cleaning agent eventually waned with the Industrial Revolution, which introduced mass-produced soap, hot water plumbing, and the long, slow decline of bodily fluid-based domestic chemistry. But in the medieval mindset, urine wasn't filthy, it was useful. It was part of a cyclical, waste-nothing approach to life, where everything from animal bones to onion skins to bodily waste had a second life. Some monasteries even had rules about how urine should be collected and used. In a way, this speaks to a larger medieval philosophy. Survival wasn't about comfort, it was about function. If something worked, it stayed. If it smelled, you got used to it. If you had to carry a pot of pee across town just to get your chemise a shade lighter, well, that's what you did. And so, the next time you toss your shirts into a washing machine with perfumed detergent and color-safe bleach, remember that you are the descendant of people who scrubbed their linens in human ammonia, stomped on them with bare feet, and then hung them out under the sun while the neighbor's goat chewed on the drying line. Their world was hard, fragrant in ways we can barely imagine, and powered not by luxury but by raw necessity. And in that necessity, there is an odd sort of admiration, because if they could make their clothes white again, using nothing more than last week's chamber pot, then maybe, just maybe, we're not quite as advanced as we think. In the sweltering fields beneath a relentless medieval sun, long before the age of zinc oxide tubes and SPF ratings, people had to get creative if they wanted to shield their skin from the burning rays. Enter the most unexpected of medieval allies: sheep grease. Yes, that unassuming, thick, sticky, and somewhat foul-smelling substance known as lanolin became, for many, a natural barrier between their vulnerable skin and the elements. The life of a medieval peasant didn't allow for much shelter during long hours outdoors. Whether tilling fields, shepherding livestock, or gathering herbs and firewood, one's exposure to the sun was constant and unforgiving. And while tanned, skin in our time might be seen as a sign of summer leisure, in the medieval world it was often a badge of grueling labor. A deep, weathered tone that marked someone as a member of the working class, yet too much exposure brought not only discomfort but real danger: cracked lips, flaking noses, blistered arms, and raw scalps. And in a world that lacked aloe vera gels and first aid creams, people turned to the tools available right around them, often right on the animal's back. Sheep grease, or lanolin, was not extracted with machines or chemical refinement in those days. Instead, it came naturally clinging to the wool that was sheared in spring and autumn. When wool was washed or even just handled roughly, the greasy substance that coated the fibers would be collected by hand. This sticky residue had long been noticed for its curious waterproofing qualities. Shepherds observed how their own hands remained strangely supple and protected after shearing sheep all day. Over time, this wasn't seen as coincidence, but rather as a kind of peasant wisdom. If sheep grease kept shepherds' hands from chapping in wind or splitting in winter, might it also ward off the punishing sun? And so, the practice began, it not only on one's hands, but across the cheeks, the neck, the forehead, and even the lips. The consistency wasn't pleasant. Imagine the texture of petroleum jelly, but thicker, with a smell that hovered between barnyard, must, and animal warmth. It clung to the skin in a tacky layer, collecting dust and bits of hay. But as far as protection went, it worked shockingly well. Lanolin's semi-occlusive barrier could slow down moisture loss and provide a rudimentary layer against UV damage, not unlike the logic behind modern sunblock. It wasn't just the peasants who used it either. Travelers, soldiers, and shepherds, alike anyone whose trade or duty kept them in the open, eventually came to adopt it, often blending it with other materials. Crushed herbs like lavender, rosemary, or marigold might be added for their scent, or for an extra soothing effect. Some mixed lanolin with beeswax for a firmer consistency, creating a kind of medieval salve that could be scooped from a wooden container and rubbed across the skin before heading into the field. Others, desperate to avoid the sun entirely, would use lanolin not just as protection, but as a base for white clays or crushed chalk, turning it into a sort of primitive face paint that not only cooled, but concealed. This accidental cosmetic use was, of course, not a fashion statement. It was survival. For children, particularly those sent out to collect wood or watch over crops, sheep grease was sometimes rubbed onto their exposed limbs and ears. Mothers would keep a small pot of it near the door, not for glamour, but for health. In colder climates, it doubled as frost protection. In warmer ones, it softened cracked skin and delayed burns. And if you ever found yourself without access to a wool-giving sheep, some turned to other animal fats, pork, lard, goose grease, or beef tallow, of which had similar protective qualities, but lacked lanolin's natural stickiness and ability to soak into the skin over time. This meant that sheep grease was still considered the superior option. It wasn't uncommon for households with access to wool to preserve bits of the grease for trade or for gifting to relatives who lived further afield. In that way, lanolin became a kind of rural currency, not glamorous, but immensely practical. Beyond skin protection, it also became a remedy for cracked nipples in nursing mothers, for dry heels, and even for minor wounds. If you walked into a medieval peasant's hut and saw a lump of yellowish, waxy substance stored in a pig bladder or pottery shard, odds are it was sheep grease waiting for its next task. In more superstitious communities, it even gained quasi-magical associations. Some believed that lanolin could protect against sun fever, a condition blamed on too much exposure to heat and thought to cause madness or spiritual possession. To avoid such fates, villagers would anoint their temples or rub a greasy cross over their chests before setting out under the high summer sun. Shepherds, already surrounded by sheep and the smell of wool, would practically glisten by midday weather, from sweat, grease, or both. The method wasn't without its drawbacks. Insects, particularly in summer, found lanolin-covered skin quite interesting. Dust and soot would stick to it, giving some the look of having rolled through an ash pile. There was also the social element. While lanolin served a purpose, those who used it heavily might be called wool-faced or greasebrowed, teasing nicknames that pointed out the obvious. But even the jesters and mockers knew the value of the stuff. They, too, would reach for the pot when their own arms began to peel. And in times of war, when soldiers marched long hours beneath boiling skies, many carried a pouch of the same substance tucked beside their rations. Monks in some regions recorded the practice with faint disdain, noting that peasants wear not the veil of prayer, but of beastly wax. Yet even some abbots secretly used lanolin when their skin cracked from outdoor labor. The truth was, it worked. And in an age where remedies were hard-won, and often based on generations of observation, anything that protected the body, even if it smelled like a sheep pen, was worth its weight. Modern science has since confirmed what those muddy-footed ancestors already knew. Lanolin really does reduce water loss through the skin, traps moisture, and offers a degree of protection. Today, it's refined and bottled, used in baby products, lip balms, and skin creams worldwide. But back then, it came raw, straight from the fleece, unfiltered and pungent. There is something oddly poetic in imagining a medieval farmer, his face glistening not with designer sunscreen, but with the distilled labor of his sheep. His cracked hands shining faintly as he shields his brow and looks out over the sunburned hills, armored, not in metal, but in grease. And that quiet, resourceful stubbornness, that too was part of surviving the sun. Because when life burns you daily, and there's no shade in sight, you reach for whatever you have, be it prayer, shadow, or sheep. In the heart of a medieval winter, when the air snapped with cold and every breath felt like it had been sharpened by ice itself, one of the most crucial survival tools for a village wasn't forged from iron or stitched from wool. It was buried deep in the coldest corners of nature itself. Imagine a time with no electric refrigeration, no insulated ice boxes, no plastic-wrapped food waiting in a chilled cabinet, just you, the snow, and a pressing need to stop everything from spoiling. And yet, long before refrigeration was mechanized or modern, medieval communities had devised a surprisingly efficient system for preserving perishables. And it all began with watching rivers freeze. As soon as the water turned to ice, villagers would head out with heavy picks and saws to cut thick blocks straight from the frozen surface. These weren't thin sheets you could snap between your fingers, they were dense, solid slabs of ice, thick as a man's forearm, and heavy enough that two people were often needed to carry just one, wrapped in cloth, sometimes layered in straw. The blocks were dragged or carted to large communal storage pits, or into stone-lined ice houses, specifically built to hug the cold, deep underground, where the sun dared not intrude. These ice houses were often positioned in shaded areas, north-facing when possible, and constructed with double-thick stone walls and packed earth to create a kind of primitive refrigeration chamber that could hold the cold for months. Inside, layers of ice were stacked, separated by straw or sawdust for insulation, and each layer was carefully monitored for melting. Any trickle of water was assigned to rearrange, repack, or dig deeper for colder earth. Meat, cheese, butter, and even barrels of milk were buried under layers of ice or nestled in straw near the walls. The cold didn't just preserve food, slowed down life itself. Bacteria and mold, the twin enemies of survival, were held at bay by the freezing grip of the subterranean chill. Villagers would descend into these frosty chambers like monks, entering a crypt, retrieving small bundles of preserved meat or a chunk of butter so cold it steamed when brought back into the warmth. And while ice houses were more common among wealthier households or monasteries, even poor peasants adapted the method in miniature. They dug deep pits in the coldest corner of the forest, lining them with stone or wood, and covering them with thatch or moss. Snow was packed in by hand and tamped down to squeeze out warmth, then topped with heavy logs or clay lids to seal the chill inside. It wasn't just about food. Either sometimes medicinal herbs or roots were stored in these spaces, kept from rotting until spring brought planting time again. In particularly resourceful towns, blocks of river ice were even treated like a form of currency traded between communities, or gifted by monasteries to struggling families who needed a bit of extra preservation power. The sheer weight and fragility of these blocks made transport difficult, so creative solutions emerged. Sleds fitted with wet cloth to slow melting, early wagons lined with straw and fur, and even cold cellars dug next to the homes themselves, to store a few pieces without trekking to a communal depot. In some towns, children were dispatched to monitor melting or rearrange straw layers, making ice management a family task passed through generations. In winters where the river didn't freeze deeply enough, panic could set in. Villagers would attempt to fake an ice harvest by mixing packed snow with salt and straw, creating a kind of slushy insulation that worked in a pinch but never matched the endurance of a true river-cut block. There are even records in some abbey manuscripts that describe how monasteries calculated the ideal depth of freeze based on the echo of their picks striking the surface. The ice rang like a bell. It was still too thin. If it thudded like damp wood, they knew it was ready. Over time, traditions built around the harvest. There were festivals tied to the first safe ice cut, with songs sung to encourage a long, deep freeze. And old women would sometimes toss a pinch of flour onto the surface of the river and read its patterns like tea leaves to predict the harvest ahead. Those who succeeded in gathering enough ice early could breathe easy for months. Those who failed had to smoke, salt, or bury their perishables and hope the rodents or the thaw didn't get to them first. In rare cases, especially wealthy landowners even designed elaborate underground ice labyrinths that connected to their wine cellars, allowing cold air to travel through passages and keep not just meat but ale and cider pleasantly cool year-round. The ingenuity extended to shape too. Some ice was cut in domed blocks or wedges to better pack corners and reduce air gaps, while certain villages developed techniques for icing cloths soaked in brine that helped stretch the life of their frozen treasure. Sometimes, when summer crept too close and the last ice began to drip, the water was collected and reused, sometimes for bathing, sometimes for chilling drinks for honored guests, and in one recorded instance, even for a baptism, in what must have been the chillest christening of the century. And while we may laugh now at the idea of digging up river ice and hiding it under straw like some ancient secret stash, to the medieval mind, this was not just practical, but sacred. Ice was life, preservation, health, and foresight all rolled into one shivering block. It was a promise of freshness in an era where decay lurked in every warm corner. It was an echo of winter's bite, kept alive in the breathless heat of August. And perhaps most importantly, it was a reminder that survival often came not from force or fire, but from a quiet understanding of nature's rhythms, from knowing exactly when the river would freeze, and exactly how to hold on to that moment for as long as humanly possible.